Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first online community meeting for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Plan update. The purpose of hosting this online is to balance the health risk associated with COVID-19 while appreciating the public's input in a transparent and open manner during the current state of emergency. The public will not be physically able to attend the meeting. As a result, the city is hosting this online meeting as an opportunity for people to provide comments, feedback, and/or questions. Other alternative means of communication and feedback are also being considered to solicit additional input in the near future. We greatly appreciate your commitment to serve your community. I can't physically see all of you tonight, but I definitely feel your good energy. To show up and to make time for this during this current situation means so much, and we really want to have this ongoing conversation with all of you. We have an important thing to talk about this evening. During the presentation, you'll learn a lot about what's going on in Burbank, and I bet you'll also share a lot of information as well to us. This is our first online community meeting, so please bear with us if we experience any technical difficulties. Tonight's meeting, which includes a presentation by staff and consultant, as well as a period for question and answers with participants, is scheduled for an hour and a half. Tonight's presentation is also live on YouTube, and it will be recorded and rebroadcasted on the city's TV channel. We also anticipate to hold future workshops and community meetings online. As noted, you will have opportunities to share your input. There is a Q&A feature on the bottom of your computer or cell phone screen. At any time during the presentation, please type your question by clicking the Q&A icon. We will do our best to respond to some of the questions during the meeting. All questions and responses that we're unable to get through during the meeting will be posted on the city's website during the following days. During the meeting, you'll also be participating in a live poll and we'll be asking questions, and you can provide us feedback immediately and confidentially. When it's time to talk, you'll be asked to click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. If there is not enough time, please make sure to provide your questions and comments in the Q&A icon. Those that are speaking will have a maximum of 3 minutes, and you'll only be able to speak once due to the time limitations. And at this time, even after the meeting, you can always contact me, and we'll be providing our email address and phone number at the end, and it'll also be available online. With me tonight, we have two of our consultants with Rincon Consultants, Hannah Mize and Andrew Beecher. And Hannah Mize will start.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to jump into an agenda, kind of run through the day here this evening for us. We'll start with some introductions, and then we're going to go through a background. That'll include what's in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Plan, what that actually is, why it really is important, some of the drivers for greenhouse gas reduction planning, the scope of the greenhouse gas reduction update, that's this current document, how it's connected to the document that was drafted originally in 2013. And then we'll also run through the schedule. From there, I'll pass it over to Andrew Beecher, my colleague, and he'll run through the work that's been completed to date. That's going to include the greenhouse gas emission inventory with the community and the municipal subsectors. And then we'll discuss progress since 2010, greenhouse gas emission forecasts, greenhouse gas reduction targets, and other ways to stay involved. Really excited. From there, we're going to open it up to the next steps and then discussion, so everybody can kind of have an opportunity to chat. Again, if you do have some, comment during the polling period, please raise your hand and we will try and call on everybody that we can. All right. So to do a quick introduction, again, this is perfect. Thank you very much. We have from Rincon, my name is Hannah Mize. I'm the project manager, and we're working with city staff. It's been a real pleasure to work so far with Fred Ramirez, you guys are on screen. Assistant Director, Community Development, and then Karen Pan, Administrative Officer. We also have Andrew Beecher on the right. and he is the technical lead with Rincon. Again, my name is Hannah Mize. We're both from Rincon Consultants and kind of assisting with this project as well as a few others at the city. So really a real pleasure working with everyone so far. All right, now we can jump in to the background. Great. So to start off with, what is a greenhouse gas reduction plan? Well, it's a really good question. It's a plan for reducing greenhouse gases and improving quality of life for the residents, the business owners, and the visitors of Burbank. It's really important that we have a plan that can guide us in this direction, and it is based on the greenhouse gas emission inventory, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Greenhouse gases or GHGs, they're gases that are trapped in the atmosphere. And the primary gases that are associated with communities are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So on that, just to kind of provide a little bit of information, the main human activity that emits CO2 or carbon dioxide is the combustion of fossil fuel. That could be coal, natural gas, or oil for energy and transportation. Methane is usually emitted from energy, industry, agriculture, and waste management activities. And nitrous oxide is emitted from agriculture, transportation, industry, and other activities by humans in general. So these are the main components that we'll be talking about in the inventory when we get down there with Andrew Beecher. Next slide, please. All right, why is this greenhouse gas reduction plan important? So there's a couple main things here. It really establishes policies to reduce the city's fair share of emissions. And what that means is a reduction in line with the state's goals, which we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. So fair share, it's a terminology that's generally used in climate action planning. And again, it really just means alignment with the state's long-term goals. The greenhouse gas reduction plan will also help achieve multiple community goals, such as lowering energy costs, reducing air pollution, and supporting economic development. These could be considered co-benefits. And when we get to the greenhouse gas reduction plan document itself, we'll really speak to those and the benefit of these co-benefits and which ones align with which measures. It's a really big piece. And then increasing the community resilience and adaptive capacity. By adaptive capacity, we mean the ability or potential of a system to respond successfully to climate variability and climate change. And that includes adjustments in both behavior and in resources and technology. And that's a definition provided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, super kind of an oversight committee for climate change. Next slide, please. So, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about the drivers for climate action planning and what this looks like in the state of California specifically. This is on a state level. There is legislation that encourages local governments to reduce emissions, both at the municipal and the community level. We're going to talk more about those emissions a little bit later. Just as a quick reminder, there is a lot of kind of subsets here. The municipal inventory is a subset of the community, so we'll run into that a little bit more, but kind of want to touch on that and the importance of these specific bills. So we have Assembly Bill 32, which was signed in 2006, and it establishes two main goals. So we have the greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020 is goal 1. And then the second goal is to reduce GHG emissions to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. So those are the first kind of components of climate action planning legislation in California. This is the reason that we've established these goals at the state level is to align with some of the more international goals that have been established since then in Senate Bill 32, and that's to reduce emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. So really have that on the visual here on the left. We're looking for a 2020 reduction of, below 1990 levels, 40% by 2030. And then we have one of the executive orders after that, B5518, which establishes a goal of carbon neutrality by 2045. And it's anticipated that the carbon neutrality goal established by that executive order will be included in an upcoming Assembly bill or Senate bill. And we've really tried to design the climate action plan to be future-proof in the sense that it encourages carbon neutrality by 2045 and really reaches towards that goal. I think that that's something that's going to be important to note at this time. Perfect. So next slide, there we have kind of just a chart here on the left showing that, and the carbon neutrality popped up if that one. Didn't see that before. Awesome. So moving into the scope, this is something that's really important to establish an effective greenhouse gas reduction plan. And in other cities or in other areas, jurisdictions, you might hear the word climate action plan. They're the same thing. It's just the terminology kind of that we're going with here. So to establish an effective greenhouse gas reduction plan, it's really a collaborative and iterative process, and it's essential to have 4 kind of main components. Community participation is of utmost importance. I think Karen really emphasized that at the beginning. We want people to feel, excited and interested and get as much kind of insight at the forefront as possible, so we can make sure that it's really a plan that the city can use and that's designed with the community in mind. So that's something, I think that's going to be one of the strongest pillars, even though on here, all of the circles are the same size. Community participation is really, really, really a big component of this. We also have state regulations. We touched on those a little bit, and those are drivers for climate action planning and climate change goals. However, without community participation and city actions, which we have on the right, it would be really hard or really nearly impossible to reach some of these state goals that are included in the regulation level. Then we have the state agencies and regional agencies. They do play a big role, and they do reduce emissions at kind of the broader level, and that's based on some of the things that the community does throughout the process. So really 4 components here. Again, the main takeaway here is that it is a collaborative and iterative process, and it really does take a whole team to get something that's effective and implementable down the line. Next slide, please. Awesome. So I really want to take a step back here before we jump into this 2019-2020. I guess we did a 2019 inventory, but 2020-2021 greenhouse gas reduction plan update, and take a look at the 2013 GGRP. So just to set kind of the stage here, this is a document that we are pretty familiar with at Rincon, and this is something that really set the stage for this document, the updated version. It provided, in general, a set of measures and actions for Burbank to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to meet Senate Bill 32 GHG reduction goals. And again, that we talked about those a little bit earlier, something really exciting that Andrew will touch on, those goals were met in 2020. So the city was able to reduce emissions in line with that. Many of the measures were really successful. A lot had been done really between 2013 and now. So huge props. I just want to recognize this. I think this is really important because without kind of having a baseline, it's hard to know where to go from here, but there has been a lot of success in the city. So another few points here before we move forward. The 2010 GHG inventory was used as a baseline for setting reduction targets in both 2013 and the current GGRP update document. Again, Andrew will talk a little bit about those, the targets and how they're in line with the state goals, what that really looks like. Next one down here, we have the GGRP update will update targets to align with the new Senate Bill 32 GHG reduction goals. Again, really important to kind of be iterative and keep in line with the goals that are going forward and that have been established since the plan was originally drafted and adopted. That's something that's, these documents are generally a living document, something that doesn't just sit on a shelf, but provides, multiple versions so people can continue to upgrade and change as technology and new information becomes available. The final item here that we have listed is the greenhouse gas update intended to build upon successful measures and update based on new technology and trends, as I was kind of just mentioning. So that means when we're going to draft the new measures in this greenhouse gas reduction plan update, we're going to review, and we have been reviewing what was successful, how those were implemented. And then a lot of those things were really tracked well by the community and by the city. So there's just been a lot of things that we can transfer over. Some of the measures are, have either reached the end of their life or are a little bit being revised and redone. So they are more applicable to what the current technology is and what's available. So there's a lot of opportunity is kind of what I'm trying to say. They're really, really exciting. Again, I want to mention, although more work needs to be done, and we will discuss that a little bit later, there has been a lot of successes. There are 2 successes I want to note specifically, just as far as the original GGRP. So since then, since the 2013 timeframe, 5% of existing residential units and existing commercial floor area installed smart grid compatible technologies, which includes smart appliances, programmable thermostats, and internet-based displays. And that was for existing residential and existing commercial. And then for new residential and commercial, 15% of those units and floor areas installed smart grid compatible technologies. Again, smart appliances, programmable thermostats, internet-based displays, stuff like that. So really, one of the things that was successful allows for programmable timeframes and kind of to use things when energy is most renewable and most affordable. So pretty cool. And then one other success, just to note, this one may not be carried forward, but something to be recognized as a really large success is 6 homes per year were installed a cool roof through 2020. And there was over 100,000 square feet of non-residential cool roofs installed through 2020, both reaching the goals established in the original greenhouse gas reduction plan. So don't want to, go too far down this road, but I did really want to mention that there has been a lot of success, a lot has been done, and kudos to everybody, and really just wanted to emphasize that. Next slide, please. Awesome. So looking forward, kind of taking the next step before we jump into the work that's been completed to date. Here's a general kind of a time frame that we have for these greenhouse gas reduction plans. We start off by establishing a baseline inventory. This would be an updated baseline in this case for 2019. That was the most recent year with the most complete data set, because we started this in 2020. There was a full year of 2019 data. We took that and established just the most recent baseline available. From there, we designed forecast, kind of what that would look like, what emissions would look like going forward under 2 scenarios. Andrew's going to speak to these a little bit later, but there's a business as usual and there's an adjusted scenario. Business as usual is if nothing changes. How does that look going forward? And we chose a couple of different years specifically, 2030, again, to align with the Senate bill. We have I believe it's 2035 to align with the general plan year, and then 2045 to align with the executive order for carbon neutrality. So those forecast the emissions out under those 2 scenarios for each of those 3 years. And then we established a target. The target is how are we going to meet the state's goals? How are we going to reduce the city's fair share of emissions going forward? And what does that really look like? So that's kind of where we're at now. One of the components in here underlined at the bottom is ongoing public outreach and community involvement. Again, really want to reiterate how important it is that the community is involved and that there's opportunities to provide feedback. So going to try and provide a handful of various, forums and avenues so people can have their voices heard and ideas integrated into the climate action plan. So if you do have ideas, please shout them out. We're really excited and want to make sure that we're making something that's implementable at the city level for all community members. One of those things we'll touch on a little bit later. There is a survey available. So if you haven't taken that yet, please feel free. That's on the city's website. From here, we're going to select some strategies. Again, we're working on that phase right now by reviewing and revising some of the existing measures and strategies. We're upgrading some of those and gonna run those through with the city, take them to the community, make sure that everybody kind of has an opportunity to provide feedback and see what's really interesting and exciting for them. So that'll be the next step. And then find funding for these strategies. That's a huge component. I think in general, there are a couple benefits of having a greenhouse gas reduction plan or climate action plan. And one of those main benefits is actually having opportunities for additional state funding through grant programs and other avenues, loans or programs where the state or federally will fund things at the city level because there is a climate action plan available. So there are a lot of funding options, but given the current state of coronavirus and the impact there, it's something that we really want to focus on and emphasize that some of these things are implementable and how that's going to get done. Last step, before these kind of all repeat, again, for the next phase of climate action planning is establishing a monitoring and tracking mechanism. In this case, that would be CapDash. It's a proprietary tool that Rincon has designed to basically track emissions. So it's really a cool thing. It's a tool that can be updated annually, and it's something that basically provides a real-time dashboard of emissions and allows tracking of measures, implementation, and progress so far. So this is kind of a general outline. We've completed steps 1 through 3. Moving on to step 4. Again, public outreach is kind of community and public outreach is a component throughout. Really, really important. So there's not just one phase where that falls into the circle. And then I think from there, we can run through the work completed so far. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. Andrew, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Hannah. And thanks everyone for showing up today. My name is Andrew Beecher, work with Rincon Consultants. I'm working mostly on the technical side of this work completed to date. And I'm going to take this time to run through those first 3 items that Hannah was talking about: the greenhouse gas inventory, the emissions forecast, and the reduction targets. Next slide, please. But before we dive into the numbers, wanted to take a minute to bring this back to the community and how the greenhouse gas emissions that we're talking about with this plan relate to our collective actions, our everyday activities for residents and businesses. So most of us have a good idea of how to live more sustainably, but when it comes down to greenhouse gas emissions, we just want to highlight some ideas for how you can personally make an impact. One way, which is recommended by the EPA, is conducting your own greenhouse gas inventory, calculating your carbon footprint. This can set a baseline of your habits, and it can highlight areas where you can make changes to reduce your own carbon impact. And there's also a lot of areas where you can make an impact on local greenhouse gas emissions, which would be considered the community greenhouse gas emissions and contribute to all the emissions that the city is trying to reduce through this greenhouse gas reduction plan. So one key area is energy use in our homes. We can install solar panels or choose to have more efficient appliances. And then also the vehicles we choose and how we power them can have a large impact. We can choose not to drive by riding bikes, walking. We can purchase electric vehicles, and then also utilizing public transit. And lastly, we don't want to forget the age-old reduce, reuse, recycle, but also composting is another major way that people can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And so, next slide, please. And so now when we're talking about a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, first we want to talk about the community scale of the emissions, which, like I said, is everything that happens within the city, which is activities from individuals, businesses, and the city itself. But it's people's everyday actions that collectively contribute to this whole greenhouse gas emissions inventory. To provide some background before we get into the results, the greenhouse gas emissions in an inventory are calculated using a really simple formula. It's an activity data that generates greenhouse gas emissions, or activity data, multiplied by a greenhouse gas emission factor, and that equals greenhouse gas emissions. It can be complicated, or it can really be this simple. But then when we're talking about a community greenhouse gas inventory, we're also looking at these 4 primary sectors where greenhouse gases are emitted. And this is energy, transportation, waste, and water. Each of these emission sectors have an associated activity and an associated emission factor from which greenhouse gases are calculated. But the key piece here that we want to highlight is that a lot of this activity data that's going into this greenhouse gas emission inventory can be influenced by community members, either individuals or businesses. But then the other piece, there's the greenhouse gas emission factor. People don't have as much control of that, and that's where the state and city will come in and kind of help push the needle. But there is a huge opportunity for individuals in the energy sector to reduce their energy use, or in transportation sector, reduce how far you drive, or even choose more fuel efficient vehicles. Then waste, reducing the waste landfilled, and then water, just reducing your water consumption. So I just want to give a little bit of background on that, and now want to hop into the actual greenhouse gas inventory that we calculated that we're doing for the greenhouse gas reduction plan. Next slide, please. So as Hannah mentioned, we calculated greenhouse gas inventory for the year 2019. It was the most recent year that data was available, and it's great because it's a really recent year. So you can really get a pretty accurate picture of the actual conditions right now. So kind of the main piece that we want to highlight here is that these emissions are mostly made up from transportation and energy. While the total emissions are about 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, and you might be asking, what's a metric ton of carbon dioxide? It's about what your car emits if you were to drive from here to Pittsburgh. But even that is pretty hard to comprehend doing that 1 million times. But really, we want to look at the areas where greenhouse gas emissions are largest, which is energy sector, 53% of greenhouse gas emissions. This is looking at electricity and natural gas use in both people's homes, multifamily homes, and businesses, warehouses, restaurants, you name it. And then also is another large sector is transportation sector. In this area, we're talking about on-road transportation, via trucks, passenger cars, and then also we're talking about off-road transportation, which is construction equipment, forklifts, or even lawn and garden equipment. And public transit is also included in there. And then much smaller emission sources are water and solid waste. These are still really important, and they can be effective ways to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions, but they aren't the bulk of it. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, energy, transportation are two main sectors. Just want to break this down a little more clearly for you. Just take a second here. On the energy side, we're looking at natural gas and electricity use taking up all of the energy sector. Natural gas takes up about a quarter of energy consumption in the city. The hard part with natural gas is there isn't really a great way to reduce using it, reduce the emissions from it without just reducing using it. It's mainly fossil fuel, and when you burn a fossil fuel, you can't really stop that from emitting carbon dioxide. But then there's the energy sector where the city can make a really big impact on how these emissions are in the future. And this can be done through increasingly purchasing more renewable energy. And then also residents and businesses can make an impact in this sector as well by installing photovoltaic and choosing to purchase more efficient appliances. And then next, touching back on transportation for just a second, you can see here that really large portion of these transportation emissions are passenger vehicles. And this is really people commuting to work, to school, running errands, everything we do, everything we drive a car for. But this is a huge bulk of the transportation emissions. And then much smaller portion is commercial vehicles, which is heavy trucks, delivery trucks, trash trucks even. And then public transit and off-road emissions are much smaller portions. Next slide, please. All right, time for a poll question. So does this 2019 inventory that we just went over align with what you anticipated percentage-wise? We're talking about, did you think that energy would be about half and transportation would be same about half, but a little bit smaller? Yes or no? A poll should be popping up for you. And then we'll go over the results in just a sec when we get some results in. All right, cue some Jeopardy music.
Let's give it about 10 more seconds. I see people are still responding. Okay, we can end the polling. Share.
All right. That is a pretty good split. So thanks for participating. Looks like about half of you thought that this would align, and then the other half didn't expect these percentages to be what you thought. So thanks for the participation. Really appreciate it. And then I think we also wanted to stop now and answer some questions if there are some.
Yes. Lucia, do we have anyone that has their hand raised? I see one.
Yes, Carl Wurst, I'm going to allow you to speak, and then you have 3 minutes to speak.
Not sure if you're talking there, Carl, but you might be muted.
Carl, you are now able to unmute yourself, so.
Okay, I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can
We
hear
can hear
you.
you.
Okay. So did you hear what I said earlier or say it again? I think you've got some statistics here that are way off the mark. You've got 470,000 megatons of CO2e coming from transportation in Burbank. The entire world emits 37 gigatons per year. So you've got 10 times as much as the entire world emits.
Yeah, these aren't megatons. These are just metric tons.
Oh, metric tons. I'm sorry.
Apologies.
Okay. That's all right. My bad. And I was wondering, do you have any way to track emissions? I mean, have you been any way to approximate how much emissions have gone down and specifically in terms of, in tons of emissions since 2013?
Yeah, we do. And a part of the purpose of this 2019 inventory was to evaluate how much emissions have changed since 2010. We'll get to that just shortly, but just to give you quick look ahead, it's about 29% is how much emissions were reduced in those 9 years.
Okay, so since I've got a few more seconds here, I'd like to also ask if there's anything being done about getting 30% of our electricity from Intermountain in Utah, coal plant. When we talk about me saving a little bit of energy here, a little bit of energy here, and then the city is buying 30% of its electricity from a coal plant, it really doesn't make sense to have an electric car because that's like having a gasoline car.
Yeah, Carl, that's a good point. My understanding is that the coal at Intermountain is going out of commission in 2025, but I think this will be addressed later in the measure development process. We're not quite fully there yet. We're going to be in, very open conversation with Burbank Water and Power and figuring out how to reduce emissions that way. So that will be addressed soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Constantine, you will now be able to unmute yourself.
Hello, yeah, thank you for putting this together. And just to Carl's point, I know European standards have metric tons as MTU. So yeah, when I saw the capital M, capital T, I did think it was megatons as well. I have one question and then just a comment. Is the entire current greenhouse gas emission reduction plan still based on 2013 numbers? Because when I was talking to the Sustainability Commission, that was their impression. So is the whole point, or rather is part of this presentation to get our city council to look at the numbers and bring them to current, to 2020 standards? And then secondly, my comment, absolutely, I'm current chair of the Transportation Commission, and yeah, this transportation is definitely a big chunk of this. But my big concern is at the city level. I know the state wants us to create a coordinator, a sustainability coordinator. Is there a way we can petition to have city council make sure that that is a standalone job, someone who is experienced, who has a degree on this? Because I know there's talk of having it be a floating position, a rotating position of different department heads. And, when I talk to folks who are in this industry, they're like, you can't just put this on like a hall monitor for the week. You need someone who's trained and experienced in this. So is there a way for the public to petition city council to make sure that a sustainability coordinator is an independent position and answers only to the city manager?
Constantine, thank you so much for your question. This is Karen. Regarding your question about the sustainability coordinator and the the project that we have tonight, the public will definitely have an opportunity to share their thoughts on the plans and what they and all their feedback, and they'll be presented to planning board and to council in early next year. And this is the start of our conversation, and I'm happy to hear that you're thinking about what the city needs, and you're thinking about providing feedback. And so there'll definitely be an opportunity, and Andrew and Hannah will go over the timeline for this project as well towards the end.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I actually have to jump off the call in a minute. So thank you for putting this together. And I'll rewatch it later on when you guys are done.
Thank
Yeah.
you. We'll take
Thanks, Karen.
we'll take one more question.
Alejandra, you are now able to unmute yourself.
Hi, good evening. This is Alex Arciniega. Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a couple of questions. One is, what is the city going to do in terms of leadership? Because I keep hearing that we need to train the public, we need to work with the public. And as part of the public and as part of Waste Warriors, we've been working our butts off in the city to compost. And recycling is just such a myth, especially during COVID. So I think as part of the public, we want to see some changes coming from the city in terms of leadership. So when is the sustainability coordinator position going to open up? There's been talk about this that I know of for well over a year. How is the city going to work with businesses to ensure that this is going to be long-term? We need renewable energy with the businesses. And then putting this on consumers is just something that big plastics it's just been done for so long. And we really need some initiatives coming from the top that really directs this, because having these think tanks and having these meetings and having these things are just, it's more of the same. So that's one. Two, I'm entering questions on the Q&A. I don't know if you guys are seeing that. But also, I want to know specifically what has been done in terms of reducing the GHG emissions. It was a very broad overview, and if you guys could address that a little bit more, because it's my understanding that it wasn't as impactful. So I feel like I'm missing something here. So that would be really great. Thank you.
Hi, Alex. This is Karen again. And thank you so much for your feedback. It definitely helps us when we think about, us as a city with our operations, what resources and things that the community needs, or even including our businesses. And recently, City Council had their priority goals listed for the calendar year. And it was a discussion back, I think, in February, and sustainability was definitely one of those items. as a priority for the city. And we hear our community speak to, the greenhouse gas reduction plan, other action items that could address and help out with environmental initiatives. And this is the beginning of our conversation. And so with this update, and later on we'll go through measures and action items, is all part of this greenhouse gas reduction plan. So within that plan, right now we're looking at the analysis of what our inventory is. And I agree with you with, having solid action items that we can work on, and to see those measures is an ongoing discussion. Your second question was regarding the Q&A. We do see them. We have a number of Q&As that are in line, and we'll see if we can get through them today. If not, we'll make sure to post a response to your questions. And what was your third question again? I apologize.
Am I still muted? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear.
Yeah, I wanted to go into detail in terms of the GHG emissions. I think when we talk about reduction plans, I know that this is like a PowerPoint and we're doing top level stuff, but as a resident of Burbank, I would like to see more details if we can kind of like air that out a little bit, how we're meeting those goals. Because when we talk about like, oh, let's buy electric cars or let's buy solar, it's just like buy. And we're only looking at this on a very superficial level where we're not talking about the impact of what it's causing, what the true cost of producing these batteries is, what the true cost of importing our goods into Burbank and out of Burbank. So although I like that, this poll question that's water, solid waste, energy, like, what is the impact of bringing goods in and out of Burbank and producing all of these products?
I see. So you're looking for more details towards this plan of those measures and looking at the pros and cons and thinking a bigger picture when we decide to make a large decision like purchasing.
No. What I'm asking is when we talk about, hey, we're meeting our goals, our GHG levels are decreasing, like I would like to see that aired out a little bit more so we can talk about how these goals are being met. So a greater level of detail on your presentation, specifically the slide when we're talking about meeting 2013 goals.
Yeah, this is Hannah. Karen, if you don't mind, I think we're actually going to do a slide in about 2 or 3 that actually really kind of go into detail on that. Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong as well on that piece, but we just wanted to provide at the beginning kind of just a high level view. Definitely agree, though. I think it's super important to know the data points. And so that is something that we will touch on. Absolutely, for sure.
Thank you, Alex.
All right. Thanks for all the thoughtful questions. Really appreciate it. And Alejandra will discuss some of the items about progress that has been made since the 2013 greenhouse gas reduction plan. And I'll try to get into a little bit more of the details there. And then also Constantine's question about updating the 2020 standards. We'll get to that just shortly when we talk about the target setting and the reduction targets moving forward. But before we get there, I'm going to take a little time to look at the municipal greenhouse gas emissions. So as Hannah mentioned previously, municipal greenhouse gas emission inventory, this is actually a subset of the community inventory. So in a lot of ways of the activities and emissions that are happening here in this municipal inventory are already captured in this community greenhouse gas inventory that we just discussed. So we're not really adding to it or double counting anything. We're just highlighting some different pieces. And then specifically within this municipal greenhouse gas inventory, there's a couple of unique pieces with Burbank. Burbank actually has a lot of control over some pretty significant emission sources within the city. And this is emissions from Burbank Water and Power, the landfill, and the water reclamation plant. So we wanted to kind of pull those out specifically and touch on those. And then there's also the actual municipal operations, which is kind of the day-to-day workings of the city and city government and city facilities, and go in a little bit more detail on that as well shortly. Next slide, please. So first, looking at what we're calling the industrial operations of the city, these greenhouse gas emissions. Like I said, this is Burbank Water and Power's emissions, landfill, and the water reclamation plant. So Burbank Water and Power's emissions, these are from the generation of power at the Magnolia Power Plant and Lake One Power Plant, and then also from energy that's purchased from in-state and out-of-state. Then as well as the transmission and distribution losses, this is where energy is lost on its way to Burbank. So we want to count that lost energy and account for those greenhouse gas emissions as well. So another interesting piece with the Burbank Water and Power side, these emissions have a really large impact on the emissions that are generated by the whole community. Because as energy is used in the community and at the municipal government level, Burbank has to purchase this electricity. So the more electricity they purchase, it's likely that they might have higher emissions, but then Burbank Water and Power also has the ability to choose where they're purchasing electricity to choose sources with lower emissions. And then moving on to the landfill, much smaller source than the total Burbank Water and Power emissions, only 12,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide, but this is methane emitted from the Burbank landfill. This inventory was done in 2020, in 2019, but now in 2020, Burbank Water and Power is actually generating electricity from methane that's captured at the landfill. The landfill has a landfill gas capture system in place, so it catches about 75% of the methane emissions that come from that. And these emissions that are reported here are those excess emissions that aren't actually captured by that system that generates electricity. So it's a really good efficient use of emissions that would possibly be going up into the atmosphere, but they're being used to generate power, which is considered renewable electricity. And then lastly, there's a Burbank Water Reclamation Plant. This is the wastewater treatment process emissions, and these are largely under the control of the city. Next slide, please. And then so moving on to the municipal operations greenhouse gas emissions. These are, like I said, the city activities, things that are happening day to day, making everything run. It's broken up into the same sectors as we looked at for the community inventory, but here we're also breaking up into scope. And what the scope tells us is really the operational control that the city has over these emissions. So in scope 1, we have energy emissions. This is natural gas combustion. And then transportation emissions. This is emissions from the city's vehicle fleet. And then when we're looking at scope 2 emissions, these are all from electricity. So the energy emissions, which is the largest source in the municipal operations inventory. This is electricity used just in buildings and facilities, keeping the lights on, keeping everything running. And then there's also a small amount of emissions that are from electric vehicle charging in the transportation sector. And then there is scope 3. These are a little bit harder to control, but the city still has a lot of influence over them. This includes public transit in the transportation sector, emissions from water that is consumed, which is the electricity used to treat, pump water. So how much water the city consumes, they can reduce these emissions that way. And then there's also solid waste, this is emissions generated by waste that the city produces, city operations produce, and is sent to the landfill. Next slide, please. All right, so now that we've talked about the whole inventory, the whole community emissions, the breakdown of the municipal emissions, we'll start getting into the progress since 2010. So when we conducted this inventory, we found that the overall emissions in the city have reduced by 29%. Get into the details of where that happened a little bit more, but this is great. The 2013 Greenhouse Gas Reduction Plan set a goal of reducing their emissions 15% below the 2010 levels, which was the baseline inventory that informed the 2013 Greenhouse Gas Reduction Plan. They want to do that by 2020. The city has well exceeded this target, almost reaching their goal, their further goal of reducing emissions to 30% below 2010 levels. And so just to touch on areas where there was large impact, in the energy sector, there was a 1% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. A huge impact of this was the purchase of more renewable energy by Burbank Water and Power. So, even if you're using the same amount of energy every year, theoretically, if you have energy that is less carbon intensive, your emissions are going to go down. But also what happened in Burbank was there's a really high level of efficiency increases in both electricity and natural gas. So since 2010, there has been some pretty significant growth in Burbank. While this growth is going to, as you add people, add jobs, add businesses, you're going to expect that more energy is going to be consumed. But in Burbank in this time, that rate of increase has not been nearly as close when you're looking at energy consumption versus where you're looking at population and job growth. So this shows that there has been really big successes in energy efficiency. And also for the natural gas sector emissions, even though population jobs have increased, there was actually a decrease in overall natural gas consumption in the city. And then so another large area of success is transportation, which was really largely driven by increases in fuel efficiency. This isn't necessarily something that's attributed to each person in the city, but overall, the fleet of vehicles within the state has increased its fuel efficiency, and this has significantly reduced greenhouse gas emissions. Another really big key success is in the solid waste sector. Although this isn't as large of an emission source, there's really big success here. Like I said, the city has seen population and job growth, but there was a 36% reduction in the overall solid waste emissions. And this is strictly from waste being sent to landfill. So this means that the residents and businesses are diverting more waste to recycling facilities, composting. It's just really good view that there was success in that area. And then also in water greenhouse gas emission sector, in 2010, their emissions were around 20,000 metric tons of CO2. And I think this time around, we're looking at about 5,000 metric tons of CO2. So really big reduction in water emissions. Part of this is that the energy that is producing this water supply is becoming more renewable energy. So it's reducing the emissions per gallon of water provided. But also, there's been a big reduction in reliance on imported water. Imported water, specifically from Metropolitan Water District, comes from the State Water Project. It's transported from Northern California. It's really energy intensive. So more focus on reducing water consumption overall, and then making more of that from local water supply, local groundwater, and recycled water has been a really big success. And next slide, please. All right, so now that we've talked about, apologies, can take a sip of water really fast. So we talked about the baseline. 2010. We talked about the updated greenhouse gas emissions 2019. Based on this information, we develop a greenhouse gas emission forecast. And this is really how we figure out how much Burbank will potentially have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the future in order to reach these state targets established by Senate Bill 32 and Executive Order B5518. So when we start off with a greenhouse gas emissions forecast, we do a business as usual forecast. We take what's happening right now in 2019 and just assume things are just going to keep moving forward as they are. This kind of gives us, I want to say, a baseline of how things will look in the future without the impact of new policies and new state legislations, so that we can start to assess the impact that this greenhouse gas reduction plan will have on future emissions. So a key takeaway from the business as usual forecast is we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions to increase. And this is really because it's mostly scaled with population and job growth. We're assuming that the same amount of energy, same amount of water consumption, same amount of transportation is going to happen for each job as we increase jobs in the future. So then the next piece is looking at the adjusted forecast, where we consider state mandated reductions. We take that business as usual and we look at things like Senate Bill 100, where they're requiring that electricity providers are going to have to purchase increasingly more renewable energy. And we're looking at Title 24 increases, where they're going to require new homes in the future to be more and more efficient. And also looking at transportation, where cars are going to be required to be more and more efficient as well, reducing emissions in these sectors, primarily the energy and transportation sectors. So once we get our estimates of what we think those pieces of legislation will do to greenhouse gas emissions, we get our adjusted forecast, that kind of middle bottom row of that table. And from that adjusted forecast is where we're comparing what the greenhouse gas emissions are from the adjusted forecast and what the targets are based on the 2013 greenhouse gas reduction plan. And I'll get to the targets in just one sec. Next slide, please. All right, so moving on to the targets. As I said, we're looking at the targets which are based on state legislation. We've showed you this image before, but it's really just showing again how 2030, we're looking at getting to 40% below 1990 levels. And then again, which will pop up in a sec, in 2045, we're looking at getting to carbon neutrality. So these emission targets are really going to dictate how aggressive reduction policies will need to be based on that gap between what our adjusted greenhouse gas emission forecast is and what the state target is. Next slide, please. All right, so talking about that gap with what the adjusted forecast is and what the state targets are. In this graph, apologies if it's a little complicated, but I'll walk through it. We have three lines, essentially. Going back to 2010, we're looking at our greenhouse gas emissions, what they were then. Starting on the left of this image, moving down, we see that they're decreased significantly going to 2019. And this is where we start looking at those forecast scenarios. So that blue line at the top, that's the business as usual greenhouse gas emissions forecast. That's the one where we're looking at things moving forward as they are now. We see it slowly increasing with time. And then we're looking at with the state legislative adjusted forecast, where we account for Title 24, SB 100, transportation legislation. These are the emissions reduced by state legislation. And that's that gray line kind of going down the middle of that triangle, of that pie slice down there. So those are the emissions that we're expecting the state will help Burbank reduce. That's where we're expecting emissions will be. And then when we're looking at that blue line, or sorry, maybe that's purple. I'm a little bit colorblind, apologies. But that line is what the reduction targets are. So these are establishing those reductions based on state legislation. And that gap in between that gray line and that bottom line, that's the amount that Burbank will need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in order to meet these state targets. So kind of walking through what these targets are. When we go back to the 2013 Greenhouse Gas Reduction Plan, that is the city's baseline. So when we're looking at any greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in the future, we're going to keep using that 2010 as the baseline. This is based on the recommendations of Assembly Bill 32 and the California Climate Change Scoping Plan. So in 2010, we assume that greenhouse gas emissions are about 15% above 1990 levels. AB 32 established a target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels. So the target established in the 2013 Greenhouse Gas Reduction Plan was in line with this goal. And that target was reducing emissions 15% below 2010 levels. City met that target, looking good. But now, since 2010 and 2020, new legislation has been adopted. First major piece is Senate Bill 32. When we're looking at Senate Bill 32, we want to meet these requirements by reducing emissions 40% below 1990 levels. So with that 15% in 2010, this equates to reducing emissions 55% below 2010 levels. Right now in 2019, we're at about 29%. So maybe a little more than halfway there. The city also is establishing a 2035 target. This is the general plan horizon year. It's a common year for greenhouse gas reduction targets, but this target is kind of an interim year where we're setting a checkpoint onto the long-term target, 2045, reaching carbon neutrality. And this is in line with the state goals established by Executive Order B5518. Next slide. Oh, and then Hannah's going to take it away with the next steps.
Awesome. Well, that was really helpful, Andrew, to kind of understand what we're looking at. I'll run through these next steps and then we'll open it up for some discussion after that. To kind of just summarize what we're looking at today, we're running through the inventory and forecast. This is just a real high-level kind of a baseline conversation. We're going to get into the measures at our next conversation, and that, take a lot of the feedback that we're receiving. I know there's some questions in the Q&A about that, so want to really emphasize that's coming in January 2021. We're currently working on the measures right now, but there will be a time to have another discussion at that point and see if everything's been integrated and provide additional feedback and really make something that's dialed for the community and the city of Burbank. Then in April of 2021, next April, we're looking to adopt the final GGRP update based again on these kind of community feedback processes and refine the document such that it meets all of the needs of the community. Next slide, please. Awesome. So we mentioned this at the beginning. There is a survey online, burbankca.gov/climate action plan. Check that out and please provide your feedback. Really interested in hearing, again, what everybody has to say. And I'm talking kind of quick, but I do want to get through some of these Q&As to make sure we're addressing all of the comments and questions that have come up. From the survey point, once you've kind of done that, definitely want to share this information, kind of either let people know that there's a YouTube recording or that there's an opportunity to view it. They can do the survey, or just that the GHG or GGRP update is moving forward and that there are opportunities to be involved. And again, really, really want everybody to, take that opportunity if they're interested and provide feedback. Final thing on this slide, definitely want to, encourage people to promote or in whatever realm that means for you. So again, you can share things on Facebook, provide feedback, however works best. And then we have Karen's contact information here. kpan@burbankca.gov is her email address, and then the phone number listed here if you have any questions about the document and the process or progress of it at this time. All right, and next slide. I believe we're opening it up for discussion again. Each person has 30 minutes, so we can, ask questions and provide input. I was thinking, Karen, if we could maybe start with the questions that people have asked already in the Q&A, just to address all of those if we can, and then open it up. However, I'm flexible to do whatever works best for you. All right, I might just go ahead and read some of these questions, Karen. I don't know if you answer me, but I'm going to run through these and we can, I guess, maybe, I asked a question, Andrew, if you can answer it, cool. If not, I can provide an answer, but let's start taking it from the top. We have Alejandra. Can you go into detail in regards to the reduced GHG emissions? What did the city do specifically?
Hi, Hannah.
Oh, hello.
Hi. We do see one hand raised. We'll call that one first and then go through.
I don't see that on my end. My bad. Perfect.
Tamala, you will now be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation tonight to get started with this conversation. I have a lot of questions, so I'll ask as many as I can and let me know when my 3 minutes is up, and then the rest of them I'll send to you. So my first question is, you mentioned the AB 32, SB 32, and the executive order requirements, or what our goals are. And my question is, what happens if we don't meet these goals? Like, what is the consequences of a city not meeting these goals, so we can understand what's at stake here if we don't? That's my first question. And then my second one is, so you presented a breakdown of the GHG emissions and where they're coming from. And you said that the goal is to reduce the emissions by 655 metric tons. And I'm just wondering, looking at that original pie graph you showed, where do you see the majority of that reduction coming from? That's I think about half, or a little bit more than half of what the current emissions are. So where do you see that potentially coming from for that reduction by 2045? And then on that note, just some kind of more specific questions. What would it take to eliminate completely our natural gas usage in the city? And if we did eliminate natural gas usage in the city, what kind of impact would that have on that goal of reducing 655 metric tons? In addition to the reducing natural gas, what kind of impact would electrifying our fleets in the city do? We've talked about that quite a bit in the Sustainability Commission and also in the community about the importance of electrifying all of our city fleets. And I'm curious about how much would that impact our GHG emissions? And then also talking about impact, we also talked about solar earlier, and I'm wondering how much of an impact moving aggressively towards solar, how would that also impact our goals for reduction? And then one more about impact. We are facing a high potential of a lot of new developments in the city, particularly around residential developments to meet our housing requirements. So I'm wondering how potentially increasing the environmental impact requirements for those developments, what kind of impact that could have, including requiring that they don't use natural gas or that they use solar or those kinds of things. And if I have time, I have one more question. And this is a little bit smaller, but it's a kind of a pet project of mine. And you mentioned about where we get our water from and how we use reclaimed water more, and that's helping because we don't have to get as much water from Northern California. And I'm wondering if there's any, in your research, if you've done any looking into the advanced water treatment plants, advanced water purification treatment plants that is recycling water to be potable, and if that's possible that we can tap into that, and if that would have any impact on GHG specifically. So I have some more, but I think that's a good start for my long list of questions. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks. I really those are all awesome questions, and I'll do my best to address them all. All right. So starting with what happens if we don't meet these goals. Really, when we're looking at 2030, that one aligns with Senate Bill 32, and that has implications for the ability for the city to use this greenhouse gas reduction plan as a planning tool to streamline. So we don't really think anything will necessarily happen if the city doesn't meet the 2030 targets, as long as the things that are included in this plan are implemented. But with that caveat is that this plan is built on the evidence that these actions will reduce emissions beyond what is needed to reach the 2030 targets. Second, talking about the greenhouse gas emissions in 2045, you are correct about that. So looking at in 2045, the goal is to reach carbon neutrality, but there's about a gap of 500,000 metric tons of emissions that will need to be reduced. When we're looking at where these emission reductions will come from, that is kind of a tricky question. A lot of it's going to be energy sector and electrification of transportation, but the state understands that there's going to have to be some new policies that come into play that will address these emissions in the future. And this iteration of the greenhouse gas reduction plan really isn't intended to fully reduce the emissions to zero in 2045, just because it's so far out and we really don't have the tools to do that yet. But the idea is to set on the pathway to get there. And that kind of goes into talking about natural gas consumption. So when we're talking about eliminating natural gas, so when we're looking at those energy emissions, they're electricity and natural gas. Electricity, we can make those emissions zero by purchasing renewable energy. And we know that that is a feasible solution, and it is an established pathway that the state is going to. In 2045, the state is requiring all energy to be carbon neutral. All electricity to be carbon neutral. The issue comes with natural gas. The idea that natural gas can be 100% carbon free in the future at the rate that we use it now, there's questions about the potential for that. So what the California Energy Commission and the scoping plant, California Air Resource Board, they're looking at electrification as a way to effectively reach the state's goals, long-term carbon reduction goals, because you can reduce that fossil natural gas use when that possibly is a resource that can't be fully made renewable. And part of the idea of this plan part of the idea of electrification is to kind of at least not increase the use of natural gas use now, and then look at reducing it more in the future. All right, moving on to electrifying fleets. Let me pull up the number really fast on my end about how much impact the city's municipal fleet has on greenhouse gas emissions. So we're looking at transportation-wise, the city generates about 8,000 metric tons of CO2 with its fleet, and that's regular city operation vehicles, public works vehicles, off-road construction equipment, pressure washers, the standard city equipment, as well as the public transit fleet. So completely electrifying that would reduce a large portion of those emissions. Moving on to solar. Solar adoption is a key piece to getting distributed renewable energy. I know there has been a push with BWP to get solar and to have more residents have solar. And this is definitely something that we will be discussing with BWP as we work through this drafting greenhouse gas reduction measures. figuring out how stringent measures should be and to what degree we will push for solar adoption. All right, next one is looking at new developments. Yes, there are. Every city in California is facing this problem where we're looking at a lot of housing needs to be built to meet the regional housing needs assessment numbers. But really, we want to focus on measures that are proven to be cost effective in this plan. If it's an electrification measure, they're going to be proven to be cost effective, and that is a requirement by the state. If you're going to have a REACH code, whereas you're requiring new developments to install solar or install certain technologies or be all electric, you have to prove that that's going to be cost effective. And then as for water, I am not 100% able to speak to that. I understand a few cities have introduced those clean recycled water plants, but definitely a discussion we're willing to have in the measured development portion as we're working on that. And it would have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions because it would reduce the city's reliance on imported water, which they have much less control over. When you're looking at local groundwater, the city has more control and they can control the emissions from that much more easily. And I think I got them all.
Yes, you did. Thank you so much for answering all those questions. I very much appreciate it.
No problem. You're welcome. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you. Karen, you will now be able to unmute yourself.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. Hi. Thanks for organizing this. This is great. So I have a couple questions. Like given Burbank's size and location and, the municipality and infrastructure, how does Burbank compare to other cities? Like as far as like if there was a progressive gauge, are we like more on the conservative side or more on the advanced side? So that's one question. And with the stats, with the emissions, how are you actually measuring those stats? Like, are there sensors in the city? Are you looking at satellite data? I'm just curious as to like where those predictions are coming from. So that's another one. And when we're looking at waste mitigation, whether it be like the increasing the actual percentage of products being recycled that's dumped into the blue bin or the green waste not having to be hauled 170 miles away from the city. As you're putting together this proposal, how stringent will the city actually adopt this plan? Also given what we're dealing with. And then I also help to organize an organization that is trying to get all the schools in the school district to be more sustainable in practice. So how do you see the schools and the school community play a supporting role or a collaborative role in this plan? So those are my questions.
Thanks, Aaron. Great questions. I can grab a few of these and do my best to answer at least the technical questions. So talking about how Burbank compares to other cities, I think the fact that Burbank has a lot of power because of Burbank Water and Power, so it has some degree of control over the electricity, it's able to really push efficiency and push these voluntary programs that don't necessarily have a lot of success in other cities. They seem to be really successful in Burbank, but I see Burbank as on the semi more progressive side, definitely. And especially for the region, definitely on the progressive side. On looking at how we're actually measuring these greenhouse gas emissions. So when we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking at the activity data. We look at, it's taking the kilowatts of electricity used, the therms of natural gas used, the miles traveled in each car of different vehicle types, and the volume of water used, volume mass of waste disposed. We take that activity data and we use best practices recommended by the International Panel on Climate Change, EPA, California Air Resource Board, and we convert those into greenhouse gas emissions. So we're not actually measuring anything. This is just the most cost-effective way and most widely accepted way in the state to get these greenhouse gas inventories. And then question about waste mitigation seemed to be more about how stringent the plan is. These actions in this plan are binding for the city. They will have to make their best effort to make sure that these are done, and there will be very transparent tracking of the progress on each of these measures over time. And then school and school community. At this point, we haven't engaged too much with the school community. I know that Burbank Water and Power has a program where they give sixth graders energy efficiency kits and do an energy efficiency program, but definitely want to keep things like that going. And I hope that answered your questions.
Thank you, Karen, for your questions, and thank you, Andrew, for answering it. It's 7:24 right now. I'll just do 2 questions from the Q&A, and then those questions that are still pending, we'll make sure to respond and post it on our website. The first question we have is, can we talk a little bit about the Green Choice program that is part of our Burbank Water and Power? So the Green Choice program, it was something that we just started this year, and it's where participants can pay an additional 1.8 cents over a regular residential rate for all electricity that they use. And the Green Choice program will definitely help residents play a larger role and personal role in supporting the growth of renewable energy in California. And each participant in the Green Choice program offsets an average of 1,600 kilowatt hours of non-renewable electricity. And that's about 4.7 metric tons of carbon. We'll definitely have more information about the Green Choice program on our website, and then we'll also provide you a link where you can find more information. I'll ask another question. Someone asked, is there a way to create an easy access website to view goals, action plan with a monitoring and tracking dashboard? Andrew or Hannah, can you answer that question?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that question. So as part of the development of this greenhouse gas reduction plan, we will be developing a very transparent, Rincon, who we're with, has already developed a transparent, clear tool that's web-based that the city can either provide a link to on their website or even embed in their website, and it can show real-time tracking of implementation of the greenhouse gas reduction plan. It will show the 2010 greenhouse gas inventory, the 2019 greenhouse gas inventory, and then also is able to easily be updated with any future greenhouse gas inventories to really show the real hard data on the progress in greenhouse gas emissions. And it can also show the progress of implementation on each of the measures that are included in the greenhouse gas reduction plan to show very clearly the city's progress, if they're meeting their timelines or if they're not. And it can really have a transparent way of the city and the public evaluating where to go as we continue to update this living document in the future.
Thank you, Andrew. So that concludes our community meeting, and my information is at the end of this presentation. If you have any other questions or would like to provide feedback, please feel free to do so throughout the entire project, and we'll have another meeting upcoming in early of next year. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.